Catherine stood at the edge of the cemetery when the last of the mourners had gone, the wind lifting the hem of her dark coat and carrying with it the faint, sweet rot of maple sap from the lane that led down to the farm. Winter had crusted the fields in white, the horses in the paddock huddled with breath like steam. She kept her gloves on because the world held its chill, but she had taken off the small chain that had been Joshua's, the one with the tiny brass horseshoe he had given her on a spring morning 20 years ago. She clutched the chain in her hand like a talisman and let the weight of it pull her toward the road she knew by habit, past the mailbox, past the red barn, past the windows where she had taught herself to paint by the drifting cool light. Before the story begins, if you're watching this as a video, stay with us through the whole telling. There's more than grief here, and the way Catherine finds her footing is quiet but sure. If this reaches you, please subscribe to follow the rest of the story, give it a like if it moves you, and in the comments, tell us where you're watching from. It matters that these places are remembered. The lawyer's office smelled of paper and lemon polish. Sunlight fell in a clean strip across the floor where the blinds were half drawn. Margaret Hale, the woman Joshua had insisted upon, steady hands, steady jaw, set a thick folder on the desk and folded her fingers on top as if to keep the papers from blowing away. Catherine watched the way Margaret's eyes measured her, a professional courtesy cushioned with something gentler. The house deed, the will, the list of assets. Margaret read aloud with a voice that tried for neutrality and failed when it reached the phrase that would rearrange Kat's life. Maple Creek Farm to Catherine Louise Mitchell, subject to the conditions laid out in Schedule B. You loved him, Margaret said at last, not a question. It was a recognition. Catherine nodded, some of the funeral's fog lifting because names and facts are lighter than feelings. There was a sealed envelope tucked into the folding of the will, tied with twine and stamped with Joshua's tidy initial. Margaret handed it over with a small apology for the melodrama of the gesture. Catherine's fingers trembled as she untied the knot. Inside was a brass key, its patina warm from being handled, and a note in Joshua's hand. For Kat, open when you are ready. For Jenna, the letter on other side. The handwriting curved and elbowed, as it always had, more certain about where to put an O than how to answer grief. Why would he do this? Jenna asked that night at the kitchen table. The small apartment by the school, papers and the stack of graded essays. She was 27, still young enough to flare suddenly, old enough to hold a resentful logic. Her phone lay face down between them. News alerts had been muted by habit. Joshua had known he was sick. That much had been said after the funeral, people circling memory like moths around a lamp. And yet, when Margaret spoke about dated messages, Catherine felt, briefly, as if Joshua had crossed a boundary he was not supposed to cross. He left a laptop at the house, Margaret said. Dated files, one for you, one for Jenna, with play orders. He recorded them over the last months. The house on Maple Creek sat under a blue winter sky the first time Catherine returned without him. The porch smelled of old wood and the faint coffee of the mornings he had been alone. Inside, everything took on a secondary, explanatory silence. Pictures leaned in frames, their glass reflecting someone who used to be there. Catherine's hands found the studio door on instinct. The light there was north-facing, pale and patient, and the easel stood with a sheet of canvas still clipped, a faint ghost of a brushstroke along the edge. Her past lay in the dust on the floorboards. Ellis met her at the gate. He had been at the farm for 10 years, stable manager, unofficial steward, the man who knew when the irrigation pump hiccuped or the mare would go into labor. He wore the same simple jacket as always, hair pulled back, hands shaded with the marks of work. He did not touch her. Some things were learned in proximity. We kept things as he left them, Ellis said. There's a laptop on the kitchen counter, charged and waiting. Catherine found the laptop where he said, open, a small external hard drive beside it, a set of flash drives labeled with dates. The first file bore a timestamp from the week before Joshua's death. She sat at the kitchen table and pressed play with an ache in her chest that felt like an old habit. Joshua's face filled the screen as if he had stepped into the frame that morning and leaned on the counter. He wore one of his old plaid shirts. The camera caught the familiar tilt of his head. When he smiled, it was the small, private sort he had used when he thought no one was watching. "Kat," he said, and his voice was both ordinary and precise. "If you are watching this, my timing went sideways. Forgive me for the planning. You know me, organized, irritating. First thing, breathe. If I'm gone, don't let anyone tell you that the quiet in here is vacant. It's full. Remember to drink water, turn the heat down a degree, and, this one is important, don't sign anything in the first 30 days without reading it aloud." He let out a short laugh that looked like a release. "I'm not being mean, it's just a rule. I left maps and papers. There are things you won't know how to read without me, so I put labels. And I put a key. That key is more than metal. Use it when you are ready." The camera cursor blipped, and then he was gone, silence settling like a hand on the kitchen table. Catherine kept her fingers curled around the warm mug she hadn't meant to pick up. Her eyes watered, and she wiped him away. It was ridiculous, comfort found in recorded instructions, but it felt like being addressed by a person who understood every convolution of her stubbornness. Jenna watched with a different hunger. "He planned this," she said. "He was ready. Did you know?" Her voice carried a sharpness that was not accusation so much as searching. Catherine remembered the weeks before the diagnosis was public, a couple of doctor's visits, a night of coughing that Joshua had laughed off. She had not known the shape of what was coming. She had thought the ache in his chest was a stubborn muscle, not a timeline. Now Joshua's foresight arrived like a map with an X on it. The first complication came quickly. A letter slipped under Margaret's office door within a week, stamped by an outside counsel and signed by the Mitchell brothers' attorney. It was polite in tone and hostile in intent. The brothers challenged the legality of certain transfers on the grounds of undue influence and asset misallocation. The gist was thinly veiled. There had been a family agreement, they implied, that Joshua would not leave the land to Catherine outright. They asked, gently and with practiced concern, for a review, an equitable settlement, language that smelled of old entitlement. Catherine read the words once and then again, and the second time they had sound. Her chest tightened, not only because of loss, but because someone was arguing ownership over what still smelled faintly of Joshua's coffee. It felt obscene, as if someone had taken the volume of a private conversation and tried to make it public property. "Let them come," Ellis said when she showed him the letter. He folded it along the crease as if reading the page twice would make the threat smaller. "We'll handle them. They don't know this place like we do." That night, Catherine stood at the window of the studio and let the maples frame the moonlight. The ledger of her life, teacher, wife, keeper of horses, shifted under her feet. Her hands found a canvas, and she ran a flat brush across it without thinking. The paint came out bled and thin, and she laughed despite herself. The brush felt like an old map handle she had been saving for a voyage she had not known she'd take. Joshua's videos became a ritual. He had divided them by date and occasionally by subject. Some were practical, where to find insurance paperwork, how to access an account. Others were smaller, an admonition to Jenna to keep her sense of humor, a confession of a regret he had about a summer they had not spoken about. The intimacy of a dress made his presence in absentia both tender and irritatingly commanding. In one recording, Joshua looked directly at the camera and, after a beat, addressed Ellis by name. "Tell Kat not to let the furnace go in February. Ellis will know what to do." And in another, he spoke to Jenna with teasing sternness. The last set of recordings stood out because they had an order, dates lined up like small posts on a path. "Caught," Joshua said in one of the tapes that pulled at her like a tide. "If they come with smiles, don't be fooled. They learned a long time ago how to make their appetites look like community care. You know my rule. Ask for the paper. When Catherine shared what she had found with Margaret and the recommended attorney, Paul DeVere, a measured man with slow speech and the firmness of someone who had spent years preparing defenses, Margaret's eyes changed. "This is not common," she admitted. He anticipated questions. Paul's office smelled of coffee and the leather of chairs that had held many litigants. He laid out a strategy while Catherine listened, collecting the plan as if she were inventorying art supplies. There would be filings, yes, but first he wanted the bunker opened and the physical evidence cataloged by people who understood geological forensics. He suggested contacting an independent environmental firm. "If the claim is about guardianship and stewardship," he said, "then the best defense is to be a better steward and to show you are acting transparently." Catherine felt the words like a draft. Being a better steward sounded like a task she could bear. It sounded like a way to fold Joshua's caution into motion. She thought of the blank canvas in the studio again, and of how a white field could be territory for something to become. The bunker was an act of archaeology. Ellis found the hatch under a trapdoor in the western shed, and with a flashlight and a crowbar and a patience learned in inclement weather, he opened a space cold and smelling of dust and oil-laden earth. Stacked in metal cabinets were folders with Joshua's handwriting making small, precise notes next to engineers' signatures. There were vials labeled with coordinates. There was also a small notebook, Joshua's, where he had written in the margins with the tone of a man who had been both pragmatic and morally outraged at bullying. Pages described meetings with the Mitchell brothers decades earlier, memories of conversations where the brothers had tried to persuade land reassignments with the policy of men who believe that history is theirs to interpret. "I didn't know he kept all this," Jenna said, running fingers over a folder. Her voice carried reverence now, tempered with a dawning comprehension of the fight ahead. "You didn't have to," Catherine said. The thought that she had been the intended steward from the start felt both heavy and oddly right. Joshua had not just set out tasks. He had tried, in the language he knew, to arm her with truth. The first legal motion arrived as a polite avalanche stack of paper. Alan Mitchell had filed a petition to freeze certain transfers pending review. The language was surgical, bureaucratic. He argued, in practiced tones, that the suddenness of the will's terms required scrutiny. Robert wrote letters framed as entreaties. David stayed away until he couldn't help but pique, concerned in a way that was less performative. The first legal motion arrived as a polite avalanche stack of paper. Alan Mitchell had filed a petition to freeze certain transfers pending review. The language was surgical, bureaucratic. He argued, in practiced tones, that the suddenness of the will's terms required scrutiny. Robert wrote letters framed as entreaties. David stayed away until he couldn't help but pique, concerned in a way that was less performative. Court dates were set. The county clerk called and then called again. Catherine sat in the cold courthouse with Jenna beside her, hands folded. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and public consensus. Paul presented the documentation, Joshua's recordings on the laptop, the bunker contents, the surveys with clear chain of custody markings, notes from independent consultants who confirmed the validity of the surveys. Alan tried, with the calm of the practiced, to suggest gaps. But fingerprints of intention do not vanish under the weight of careful planning. The judge, an older man who had seen many family disputes, listened as people read aloud letters and pointed to maps. Margaret sat at Catherine's elbow like a steady instrument. At the midpoint of the proceedings, as tensions flared and Alan's voice sharpened into the procedural cadence of legal counterattack, Joshua's final video, the one dated the day before he died, played in the courtroom at Paul's request. It was a small, deliberate decision. The tape showed Joshua sitting in the very kitchen where Catherine had first played his messages. He addressed Catherine with a soft, certain affection that made the room feel like a private place invaded only by the public gaze. "Cat," he said, and then he paused as if listening to something only he could hear. "If you are here, then the worst worked out, or you learned how to make it okay anyway. I left the maps so you could see what they try to hide. I left the letters so you wouldn't have to take my word alone. And I left the key because I wanted you to know you could find the place that mattered to you and know who you were when you went inside." He smiled in that neighborly way that made people in the room soften. Don't let them take the story of the land. You don't need a man's permission to be a guardian of a thing that's been rooted longer than his appetite. There was a small silence after the video ended. Judges are trained to maintain equanimity, but even a trained face thins when the truth arrives as a simple human plea. Allen's rebuttal had less momentum after that. Legal cunning often relies on the air of ambiguity, and Joshua's recordings collapsed much of that air into concrete dates, signatures, and directives. Outside the courthouse, Robert waited with a diplomacy affected enough to be a strategy. "We all want what's best for Maple Creek," he told reporters before he could be stopped. His voice on camera had the practiced blandness of someone used to being read as earnest. "Family disagreements are hard, but we'll find the right way to honor Joshua's memory." Catherine felt the camera lights like the presence of eyes that trod somewhere between curious and mercenary. She smiled because that is what people expect widows to do, and then she let it fall from her face as the truth restored itself. Joshua had prepared not just to protect the land, but to protect the moral architecture of how it should be handled. In private, after the first legal win, an interim ruling that allowed Catherine to retain control while the full challenge was litigated, she returned to the studio and stood before the blank canvas. The light there was the same unhurried northern light Joshua had loved. She mixed colors without aim at first, then with intention. Her hand remembered, eager and rusty. She painted a broad, dark line like a boundary, and then a sweep of pale where light would fall. The horses outside pawed the snow, and the paint smelled like oil and possibility. Healing, Catherine learned, was not linear. There were days when grief closed like a fist, and days when she felt as though she might step lighter because something loosened inside. Jenna, after an argument over a leaked memo that suggested one of the brothers had secretly consulted a developer, came around and sat one night at the sink stirring tea. "He left me safe," Jenna said, voice small. "He left instructions the way he knew how. But why the bunker? Why all that secrecy?" "Because," Catherine said, "he wanted us to be ready. Sometimes protecting a thing means keeping the parts that make it valuable from being used to hurt it." She thought of the map, the key, the little journal. Sometimes it means making hard, public, a private truth. Ellis began to reopen the routines of the farm that Joshua had kept, ordering feed, checking fences, ensuring the old mare's hooves were cared for. He became, unofficially, the operational memory of Maple Creek. He also became a confidant in the way that men who have known each other through storms become confidants, quiet, matter-of-fact, and loyal. Word of the oil reserve filtered through the town like winter light through the pines, simultaneously illuminating and cold. Energy companies sniffed around with lawyers and polite proposals. Harrison Wells, CEO of a company that had made a name negotiating community-friendly extraction, arranged to visit. He came with Thomas Reeves, a senior executive known for his background in environmental steering. They wore clean suits and practical shoes, their smiles practiced and their proposals neatly bound. Harrison's pitch was careful: economic benefits, jobs, and an earnest-sounding environmental covenant. He seemed to understand the nuance of land stewardship, and when Catherine asked direct questions about containment and restoration, he answered with the ease of a man who had built guards for his reputation. "You could sell it outright," he said one afternoon in the dining room over a plate of cold sandwiches. You could accept a millionaire's check and be done. Catherine looked at him as if choosing a paintbrush. I could, she said, but that would not be Joshua's plan. He left more than money at stake. He wanted the land to be cared for. If we work together, any extraction will come with a conservation plan and a trust. Thomas nodded. We can do that. It will cost the company more in the short term, but the long term, public relations, compliance, is sound. We prefer partnerships. There was a practicality in his voice that steadied her. She felt, then, the first flicker of possibility, not because a checkbook balanced, but because someone across the table had understood what stewardship truly meant, not possession, but duty. The brothers, meanwhile, grew more frantic. Alan's motions became sharper, more surgical. Robert began to look older in a way that suggested illness or mortality, and his voice sometimes cracked when he spoke of how the family's legacy should be carried. There were moments of vulnerability, Robert writing a letter to Catherine that mentioned, with unbidden feeling, his father's stubborn love for the land. Those moments complicated the moral map. They did not absolve him. They reminded Catherine that people are rarely only villain or hero. The true turning point, though, came when the bunker files were analyzed by an independent geologist Paul had recommended. The corroboration was precise and public. The surveys showed not only the presence of hydrocarbons in certain beds, but also evidence that some transfers John Mitchell had attempted to obscure years earlier had followed a path of convenience rather than transparency. The brothers' strategies, which had relied on buried paper and friendly recollection, foundered before maps and coordinates and timestamps. At a meeting arranged by Paul in the old dining room, the one Joshua had used to host summer dinners, Catherine laid out the folders like a liturgy. She read aloud the passages that showed the timeline of offers and refusals, the signatures, the notes written in margins admitting coercion. The brothers' faces clenched and then slackened under the weight of facts they could not unmake. The public perception turned. A developer who had been in talks with Alan backed out after the firm's counsel advised caution. Harrison Wells, watching a room with a shrewd face, offered not conquest but collaboration, provided the brothers stepped aside. There followed, predictably, a bout of negotiation where shame and calculation tangled. There were offers of settlement, suggestions of shared stewardship, and the old tactics of appeasement. Catherine, advised by Margaret and Paul, did what Joshua had hoped she would do. She insisted on conditions that would preserve the land's ecology and ensure that any extraction would fund a trust for restoration and community programs. The terms were not always pretty. The settlement would cost, but it also embedded the values Joshua had left behind into legal architecture. In a quiet moment after the signing, no fanfare, just the thin, satisfying stroke of a pen, Catherine walked out to the studio and unrolled a canvas at the easel. She painted the western parcel not as a prospect, but as a place, lines that suggested rock and water, a horse in a field beneath maples, a key half buried. The painting was not a record. It was a promise. She worked through the day into night, and when she finally stepped back, the light through the north window echoed on the oils like a benediction. Jenna, who had watched the legal maneuvering from a distance at first, came to stand behind her. "He trusted you," she said, voice smaller than the room. Catherine thought of the brass key, cool now in her pocket, and of the sealed envelopes that had prodded her into action. "He taught me how to look," she said. "He taught me to trust the work." The farm moved into a new rhythm. Teams from Harrison Wells' firm came and spoke about containment and reclamation. Ellis mapped out grazing rotations that would coexist with careful surveying. The men and women who had worked the land for years watched the coming changes with wary interest, some hopeful, some skeptical. The town adjusted too. The Mitchell brothers faded from dominance, but remained as familial presences, sometimes contrite, sometimes resentful, always human. Spring arrived in a way that felt like an answer. Snow melted, not with a flourish, but with a slow, steady permission. Crocuses pushed through the thaw. The horse's breath was lighter in the mornings. Catherine installed the big canvas in the dining room where she and Joshua had eaten their first anniversary meal. It dominated the wall like a quiet newborn thing, a reminder that the world could be held and cared for even after loss. On a day when the sun lay low and gilded the maples, Catherine walked to the mailbox and found a small envelope with handwriting she did not expect. Robert had sent it, inside a pressed leaf and a note that read simply, "For the land, forgive the man I was." She folded it into her pocket and walked back to the studio where Jenna had set up a small area for pottery, her own rekindled craft. The recorded messages grew less like crutches and more like milestones. Catherine watched them now, not as directives, but as conversation, Joshua continuing to speak to her with the liberty of a man who had earned his absence. She listened and nodded, and sometimes she spoke to the empty air in the kitchen, saying things she never thought she'd have the confidence to say. "Thank you," she said once into the dusk. "I learned." There were things left unresolved, the brothers' private grievances, a community member's suspicion that the extraction could never be truly clean, Jenna's own restlessness about staying or leaving. Those things would not evaporate with a signature on a paper. But the heavy, perilous question in the title had been answered in the way Catherine moved forward. Joshua had asked, even indirectly, whether love meant giving away what one loved to someone who might harm it, and the answer had been forged in action rather than sentiment. She had not given half to his enemy in the sense of a surrender. She had chosen stewardship that balanced mercy with accountability. The brass key lived in a small wooden box on the studio shelf. Sometimes Catherine opened it and looked at it, turning it in her fingers like an idea made real. When she thought of Joshua now, she felt the mix of grief and gratitude that comes after weathering a long storm. Recognition that certain losses change the contour of meaning, but do not erase it. There would be more legal finagling, undoubtedly. There would be town meetings and proposals to scrutinize. But the core of the farm's story had been secured. The land would be tended, the environment respected, the trust funded. The painting would hang and be seen by visitors who would ask about the horses and the key and the bunker. Catherine would tell them, soft and steady, about a man who prepared a map not to preserve his control, but to safeguard the possibility of a life lived with care. As the weeks folded into months, Catherine's mornings became a liturgy of small tasks: the stable, the studio, checking in with Jenna over coffee. Ellis leaned into a tacit guardianship. Paul remained a quiet corner of legal counsel as the settlement moved from the courthouse to the practicalities of implementation. Harrison Wells Company began the months-long process of environmental planning with a conservancy that met Catherine's standards. The layers of bureaucracy folded into the daily work, which is where the real change happened. One evening, as the sky blushed violet, Jenna found a flash drive in Joshua's notebook marked only with the date of the day he had known he was not long for this world. She put it into the laptop. Joshua's face bloomed on the screen, older than in earlier reels, more vulnerable. He spoke to both of them that time, and what he said was not instruction so much as permission. "Don't let my death be the center of your lives," he told them. "Let it be the hinge. Open to the rooms you shut because you thought you had to stay small. Cat, paint. Jenna, be who you are. Love each other messy and loud and honest because the world doesn't owe you easy answers." He paused and laughed in a low, self-mocking way. "Also, stop leaving the light on in the barn. It wastes electricity." They both laughed, small and raw, and when the tape ended, the sound in the kitchen was the noise of the house, familiar, a little sad, and braced for tomorrow. Outside, Maple Creek breathed. The horses stamped and tossed their heads. In the studio, the painting caught the last light like a promise kept. The story was not finished. Legal papers still found their way into Margaret's hands. The Mitchell brothers sent an occasional letter that read like a fossil, old formations of entitlement that crumbled in the face of current weather. But Catherine woke up each morning with a kind of permission to act, to paint, to steward, to love the land without shrinking. She had, in the end, answered the hardest question, not by giving half to an enemy, but by standing where Joshua had placed a key, facing the world as guardian and artist, letting mercy and firmness guide her hands. The farm would not belong to one emotion. It would belong to work, to care, to the slow, stubborn practice of keeping what is precious. And in that keeping, there was room for forgiveness that was not naive, but was brave. A month later, with the painting drying and the papers filed, Catherine stood on the ridgeline that Joshua had always favored and looked west. The maples below were a halo of new green. The wind smelled like earth and the distant promise of rain. She took out the brass key and held it against her palm, feeling its dents and the history in its metal. She closed her hand slowly, then opened it. The key did not free her from pain, but it reminded her she had been entrusted with something larger than loss. She turned and walked down toward the barn where Ellis was waiting with a bundle of halters. Jenna followed, phone in hand, not to retreat, but to chronicle the small, ordinary moments that make a life worth owning. The road ahead was messy and full of work, but Catherine felt for the first time since the funeral that the mess was not an enemy, but a field in which to plant. Somewhere in the house, the laptop blinked. The next recording in Joshua's carefully ordered files waited with the date he had set, a conversation about the earth, about remedies, about small pleasures. Catherine pressed play because that is what you do when someone you love still has things to say. The screen lit his face for a moment, then words came, gentle, exact, reminding her to look up from time to time and see the way the light hits the maple leaves. And so she did. Joshua's voice filled the room in that slow, particular cadence he had cultivated for the camera, economical, amused, never sentimental unless he meant to be. The earth forgives us more easily than people do, he said, and the sentence arrived like a small benediction. You can cut it and plow it and let it sit for a season, and in time the seed remembers how to be, if you give it a chance. Catherine set the laptop aside and walked to the north pasture. The wind came across the fields with the smell of wet leaves and something sweet and fermenting, last year's clover gone to seed. Horses grazed in quiet lines. The meadow rose and fell like the slow chest of sleep. She felt for the first time in months a willingness to do the work instead of only to hold the grape. Joshua's permission had been to live, but his insistence on tending, on the small obligations, was a map too. They started small. First, a repair of the south fence that had sagged under a winter of heavy snow. Ellis, steady with rope and hammer, took the lead on that, speaking in the way he always spoke when his hands were full, brief instructions, a laugh that broke the quiet. Jenna filmed the work with a kind of tender attention that made the ordinary look like ritual. Grains of sawdust sparkling in the sunlight, the way the horses raised their ears to the rhythm of the hammer. Harrison's Conservancy sent a botanist to walk the property with Catherine, and together they found a strip along the creek where the invasive reed had choked the bank. It was the place Joshua had marked on his map, though Catherine had not known why he circled it. They cleared reed by reed, hauled stones to stabilize the bank, braided willow branches planted to hold the soil. Local volunteers came, a retired schoolteacher who liked to talk about birds, a young man who fished with children and brought his son's mud-splattered boots, neighbors who had never been inside the fence but who had stood at the road watching the farm change hands and prayed in ways that were more practical than language. Margaret handled the logistics, permits, forms, lists of necessary insurance, her hands moving over paper with the same assurance she had once used to move mountains in probate court. The Conservancy covered some costs. Harrison's people coordinated a matching grant that made the work feasible. Paul drew up the conservation easement language that would, in time, prevent the land from being subdivided. His handwriting on the document was the closest thing they had to a binding prayer. As the work went on, the painting in Catherine's studio moved with her like a slow companion. It widened, its light deepening and resolving into a horizon that seemed less like a boundary than a meeting point. She painted in the morning, sometimes for only a half hour before the horses needed attention, sometimes until the light sank and the studio's old bulb hummed. Each brushstroke carried an argument with memory and a negotiation with the world. Where to hold sorrow, where to let color speak. Jenna would come in afterward with coffee and a notebook and ask questions that made the brush pause. What is forgiveness here? Is it for Joshua or for them? Sometimes Catherine answered, sometimes she did not. Sometimes the paint answered for her. Word of what they were doing spread in the county like a slow weather front. An article in the county paper, Jenna's careful piece, a mixture of images and observation, called it stewardship in action. It was the phrase people latched onto because it sounded proper next to the photographs of hands in soil and a woman with paint on her cheek. The Mitchell brothers wrote again, this time more eroded in tone, their entitlement worn away by months of legal reality. 2 pages of typed grievance that insisted on debts and old agreements and a notion of inheritance that equated land with claim. Paul answered with language that had no malice, but which was as immovable as cedar. The public, by then, had a softness for the farm, a sense that a place could be defended in ways not only legal, but social. "Move the mares to the higher fields," Alice said, each syllable made of business. They hustled in the rain, ropes and slick leather and the horse's breath fogging in the cold gusts. Jenna's video was often a comfort. This time it recorded things she could not speak about. Ellis's steady movement, Catherine's insistence that the foal be with its mother, not alone in a stall. They worked with a ferocity that felt like prayer, closing gates, lashing down loose boards, bringing tools and blankets into the barn. The water hit the fence, and for a heartbeat, the world of the pasture looked like a new sea. And then the fence held because hands had braced it, and the horses were guided up the slope into the orchard's high ground. A tree fell against the north gate. Catherine saw it with the faint, electric clarity of someone watching a life change by inches. "There," she shouted, "the north gate." It was the same phrase Joshua had used in a recorded conversation about checklists, little instructions he had left for the farm, in the same tone as a man packing for travel. The irony was that his voice had become syntax for action. His inventory had become a liturgy. They pried the log loose with a block and tackle, Ellis's shoulders straining, Jenna holding a flashlight against the rain, while Catherine knelt in the mud and pushed. At one point, the foal slipped on the slope, a small slide toward the creek, and Catherine's hands were in the downpour, bracing its rump and then its head, feeling the wet fur and the frantic thud of that tiny heart. Someone, Margaret, impossibly, arrived with a truck and more blankets. She had been in town wrapping up a meeting and refused to let the rain keep her away. They brought the foal into the lean-to and wrapped it in towels as if they could stitch warmth into its bones. In the end, it was shivering but alive, trembling under the blankets like something newly saved. The morning after was a bright, gutted kind of light. The storm had cleaned things by wrecking them. Fences broken, a strip of pasture scoured. The creek changed course by an arm's breadth. People came, neighbors with pitchforks and no more sleep than Catherine had. They worked in small gangs, one the barn, one the fences, one the orchard. The county sent a crew to assess the bank stabilization, but it was the human labor that mattered. The same small movements, retying, replanting, repinning, that had saved the night before, were the ones that made the morning livable. In the studio, the painting had taken on the palette of the storm, deep grays and fresh greens, and a slash of yellow where the sun found a place to land. Catherine worked on it with an energy like someone stitching a wound closed, the brush moving with decisions made from both muscle memory and a new fierce tenderness. "It looks like the morning after," Jenna said, and there was no way to tell whether the phrase was pity or praise. The community's response hardened into something like covenant. A benefit was organized at the town hall to raise funds for the creek's repair, an auction where Catherine, against her better instincts, agreed to part with a small study of the larger painting. People bid for the study with a kind of solemn joy, the money enough to cover immediate repairs. Harrison's Conservancy accelerated the matching grant. Paul delivered a concise update to the assembly that read like a prayer in a lawyer's close. The easement was close to being signed. The Mitchells' latest complaint had been dismissed on a technicality. Catherine let the relief in slowly, as if some part of her could still prepare for another loss. There were, inevitably, moments of absurdity. The Mitchell brothers, stung by the public favor, tried once more to mount a moralizing essay in the paper, invoking family legacy in terms that sounded threadbare and rehearsed. A phone call from an old acquaintance, a curator from a gallery in the city, arrived unexpectedly to ask if Catherine would consider showing some pieces. "The painting that was in the paper," the curator said, polite and curious. "We think it speaks to something people are needing right now." The invitation felt both like recognition and like a test. Catherine wondered if her place was to keep the work on the farm, hung in a room where horses could be heard breathing in the night, or to let it speak in a different kind of light. She slept badly and then, because sleep invites action, rose and walked the ridgeline with the brass key in her pocket. The key had become less an object of control and more an amulet of permission, an idea Joshua had entrusted to her rather than an edict. She thought of opening the studio to the town, to invite people in not as patrons but as witnesses to the slow work of keeping. "Open days," she told Ellis over coffee, the words tumbling out like a decision. "Not sales, not a show, just come, see the painting, see the horses, see how the land is breathing." Ellis nodded. "People need that," he said simply, which was all the endorsement she wanted. They chose a Sunday in late June when the light slanted and the air smelled of new hay. Jenna plastered the road with signs and made a small event page that read like a conversation rather than an ad. People came with picnic blankets and babies on their hips, and old men with forks of leftover resentment softened by the sight of so many of their own faces. They wandered the studio with quiet reverence, pausing before the large painting that had become, in some modest and persistent way, a narrative of loss and perseverance. Children fed carrots to the horses. Someone read a short piece from Joshua's writings aloud, a paragraph about the dignity of ordinary labor, and the words settled into the space like rain. At the end of the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the paint on Catherine's palette had dried into a crusty map of yesterday, a woman stepped forward from the back of the studio. She had the look of one who had decided to speak regardless of consequence. "My father worked the maple wood across from your field," she said. Her voice carried the flavor of people who had lived with land their entire life. "We lost the house to development 10 years ago. We came today because—" She stopped, searching for an answer that was simpler than sentiment. "Because I needed to see someone who didn't sell." That was the moment Catherine felt what stewardship finally meant. A thing larger than herself, a patience that asked for care rather than cleverness, a refusal to treat land as commodity instead of community. The painting did not resolve anything, and neither did the easement make grief vanish, but the painting and the easement and the repaired bank were all parts of a single practice. The practice was slow and inexorable and necessary. Night fell in fine, deliberate dark. Jenna packed her camera away, humming. Ellis checked the gates. Catherine sat on the stoop with the brass key warm in her palm, feeling the day's small triumphs fold into the body of the farm. The sky was a clear, untroubled black. Far away in the white noise of the world, someone played a radio and a song about home drifted over the fields. She pressed play on one last recording, an old one, Joshua's voice younger and playful. "If you're listening to this because you need to decide what to do next," he said, and in that sentence was all the world. "Remember, the work is not a monument to me. It's an argument against despair. Keep the gate fixed, plant the apple trees, paint the mornings, love hard, and wobble with it." Catherine smiled despite herself. The key was no longer an emblem of decision. It was a reminder that the choice to continue was the work itself. She put it back in her pocket and rose. There would be letters and meetings and the stubborn, slow lawyering of everyday life. There would be more storms and more mornings, but for now, the farm breathed steady, and she would meet its rhythm. She locked the studio, the click of the old bolt sounding like punctuation. As she walked toward the barn, the painting behind her caught the last light and held it like a promise. She thought briefly of showing it in the city, and then thought of all the things that mattered that had nothing to do with gallery walls. The foal learning to trust the ground beneath its hooves, a creek not overwhelmed by and neglect, a small community that had chosen to keep something instead of taking it apart. A car slowed at the end of the lane, a silhouette against headlights. Catherine paused. Visitors were now part of the farm's new grammar. She lifted her hand in a slow, practical greeting and walked toward whoever it was, the key in her pocket and Joshua's voice still an echo in the house. Whatever came next would be a conversation between weather and work, between people and the earth that held them. She moved forward to meet it.